Despite popular belief, the U.S. war in Afghanistan is not America's longest war. That would be the Apache Wars, lasting over 75 years. But the war in Afghanistan competes for second place at 20 years long. The U.S. has invested over $2 trillion into the conflict and lost over 2,400 American lives. And that's not to mention the investment monetarily and by manpower of other nations like Canada, the UK, Australia, Croatia, Denmark, Germany, and a lot of other U.S. allies. And now that it's over and the U.S. is withdrawing, there seems to be a lot of confusion about the conflict. A lot of people seem to think that the Taliban is identical to AlQaeda and that we originally went there for the Taliban. But in reality, we really only went to war in Afghanistan to fight AlQaeda. And the Taliban even offered to hand over Osama bin Laden to cajole the United States if the United States would provide evidence that Osama bin Laden was involved in 9/11. But George W. Bush basically rejected that offer and said, we know he's guilty, you don't need proof, hand him over, we're going to keep bombing. And Taliban said, we're going to keep him until you stop bombing and give us proof. And then we'll give him to a third party neutral country for court. So basically this entire conflict from that point forward, every dollar spent, every life lost can be blamed on President George W. Bush Jr., former president. And I don't like Bush. I think he's the worst president in U.S. history, even worse than Carter. And that's saying something because I don't like weak presidents, and Carter was weak. Bush was active, but he was actively bad. At least Carter just kind of sat there and did nothing. The Taliban started after the Russian involvement in Afghanistan. As most of you know, Russia and the former Soviet Union tried to spread influence throughout Eurasia, and part of that involved a conflict in Afghanistan. And the Russians were controlling the cities, but they weren't getting any traction in the rural areas. They were fighting a costly guerrilla war. And so what they started doing was just sheer attrition, dropping mines and carpet bombing and all kinds of stuff out in the fields to try and displace as many rural people as possible to force them into the cities where the Russians had control. And this strategy was pretty successful, but it was also really successful at creating a lot of refugees. The majority of those refugees were children who ended up moving to Pakistan with their mothers, the mothers that had survived the conflict anyway. And these children would end up getting educated and radicalized by Islamists in Pakistan. And at the same time that's happening, the men who stayed behind formed what we call the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen is basically an overarching entity. It's made of a bunch of different groups. Like, for example, if you think of a gang like the Crips or the Bloods, for example, you can say the Crips and you know who you're talking about, but there's a West Coast chapter and an East Coast chapter, and there's different chapters in different cities. The Mujahideen operates in a similar compartmentalized fashion. And one of those compartments is AlQaeda. And due to personal preferences, there was this man named Osama bin Laden. He was born into a wealthy family, and he was funneling family funds and arms and helping recruit people in Saudi Arabia to the Mujahideen during the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. And after the Russians left, Osama bin Laden moved to Afghanistan and formed a splinter group of the Mujahideen called AlQaeda. And he didn't just spend all of his time in Afghanistan. He spent time in Sudan. Well, actually, he went to Sudan first. And due to U.S. pressure, this is actually really important, the U.S. pressured him to stop what he was doing because he was funding Islamic extremism and causing problems with trade wherever he went. So the U.S. pressured him to leave Sudan, and then he did. He went to Afghanistan, went into hiding, got settled, and then he declared war on the U.S. And this war on the U.S. is what culminated in the 9/11 attacks. Now, the U.S. has adapted to this and been really successful at preventing most terrorist attacks since then. War in Afghanistan was a part of that prevention. And initially, we only went to Afghanistan to find Osama bin Laden and destroy AlQaeda. At the very least, we wanted the leadership, cut the head off the snake, and that's that. Because, remember, all of these problems were from, I think, a personal grudge. Osama bin Laden didn't like that pressure, and so he held a grudge, declared war, and he acted on it. So if you kill him, then AlQaeda doesn't have a reason to come after the U.S. anymore. It's just going to be business as usual. AlQaeda would dissolve and then get absorbed by other Mujahideen groups. But after about 20 years, those refugee kids who were getting educated in Pakistan formed the Taliban, which actually translates to student, I believe. It's the plural for student in Arabic. And the Taliban came back to Afghanistan, and after the Russians left, the Mujahideen partitioned Afghanistan because they were so decentralized. Decentralization is really good because it can help your organization survive conflict with a stronger entity. But along without having a central command structure to be destroyed, you also don't have a central command structure to organize, to consolidate, and to negotiate. So the Russians couldn't negotiate leaving or anything like that, so they just had to leave and take whatever casualties they did. And the Mujahideen then, because they didn't have a central authority, just broke into all these splinter groups and controlled different areas. They put up checkpoints at the borders, and nobody could come in or out of Afghanistan. And the Taliban started attacking Mujahideen groups to break into Afghanistan, which is their home nation. And because of that, trade started to go back into Afghanistan, food and medicine and stuff like that. And because there's no more military checkpoints, there's no more tolls, there's no more smuggling fees or anything like that. So the Taliban really did a big favor for Afghanistan at this point. And then the Osama bin Laden thing happened, and now here we are. And remember, Bush asked the Taliban for Osama bin Laden, and they offered him. It was conditional. And you can say, you know, I'm part of the strongest nation, I'm the most powerful man in the world, whatever. But it's not strategically sound to reject an offer like that. You're going to keep bombing Afghanistan, and keep in mind, Afghanistan here isn't even the target. You're risking killing civilians, and you're destroying infrastructure, which, you know, if you're going by the American imperialism standard, usually you want to keep the businesses intact or fund them when you leave, and now we don't have that. Had Bush accepted that offer and just swallowed his pride and said, okay, here's some proof, we'll get you the intel, then you hand him over to Denmark or Switzerland or, you know, a third-party neutral nation in this matter, then we pursue him in court. That would have ended this war in Afghanistan 10 years ago. Longer, actually, because I believe that news came out in 2001. So basically right at the beginning of this conflict. This would have just been a blip in the radar. And some people are talking about the strategy of how to win, and I've seen people say, you know, we should have retooled and kitted up for like a huge conflict, sent 1 million troops. That would have worked. I agree with that perspective, but I don't think that was the only way to go about it. You know, had we just gotten Osama bin Laden to begin with, swallowed our pride and said, okay, hand him over, here's the proof, then this would have been over. That's 2,400 Americans that would not be dead. $2 trillion that taxpayers could be investing in highways and schools right now instead of bickering about it in Congress and not getting shit done. Because, oh, we don't have the funds. Well, you know where those funds went? They went to waste. And here's the key part of what I'm getting at. Yeah, I'm looking on Wikipedia right now, just Wikipedia is a good launching point for getting information. You get the information, you go to the sources that it has, and then you find the actual source. It's saying that this is a Taliban victory. I don't really see it as that. I would call this inconclusive at worst. Possibly just kind of something that doesn't matter. Hang on. May I ask who I'm speaking to? It was a Mr. So-and-so with the Winners International Club. They called from a private number, so I can't block them. So if they call again, that's probably who it is. The issue with the whole situation here is the U.S. is leaving. People are saying that we're retreating. We're not retreating. Some of what we're doing looks like retreating now that the country's full of chaos, but we still have the Kabul airport at the time of, well, last I checked, which was last night. So right now, maybe we don't. But we still have the Kabul airport. We're organizing with the Taliban. The Taliban are letting people through. And yeah, there's some bad apples. There's video of Taliban taking a dead Afghan soldier and parading him through the streets. I watched the video. They're not the nicest people. But at the same time, Afghanistan is unstable and full of conflict, and you gotta be an asshole to take control of a country like that and bring it to an era of prosperity. You just do. Do you think George Washington was a nice guy? He was polite, but you gotta remember, he's responsible for lots of deaths. Abraham Lincoln, 620,000 Americans, Confederate and Northern, dead. That's because you have to be strong and willing to do bad things to accomplish something good. The Union was preserved. The Union was created, depending on who we're talking about. And so I'm not diehard defending the Taliban, but they're the only group right now poised to take control and have the strength and central command structure needed to bring stability to Afghanistan. There's still conflict going on. There's still Afghan militias, and there's still mujahideen, and there's still groups of Afghan soldiers that are loyal to their original cause. They're not with the Taliban, and they're fighting. But the Taliban is the one entity that has the manpower, the resources, the social and political influence, and the central hierarchy needed to take over. The Afghan soldiers won't be able to do it, and if they can retake Kabul, they're not going to have the strength to retake the rest of the country. So at best, we would get like a two-state system, and that's not something that usually happens. We could end up like something we have in South Africa, where you have a nation within a nation, but again, probably not going to happen. Most likely what's going to happen is they're going to fight to the bitter end, and the Taliban having more equipment and more people, and the Afghan nationalists, well, I won't say nationalists, but the Afghan military not having the authority or backup of U.S. troops anymore, or international support really, is not going to be effective at taking that control. So most likely they're going to fall, and the Taliban's going to take over. And keep in mind, the people in Afghanistan, a lot of them don't like the Taliban, a lot of them do. This is going to become a political conflict, but remember, in the American Revolution, only 3% of the population were combatants. The rest just kind of sat there and watched it happen, and they had their opinions or whatever, and there were still British loyalists decades after the American Revolution. Some of them went back to Britain. Some of them stayed and then became Americanized, and that's what you get. And the majority of people, if they disagree with the Taliban, are going to do the same thing in Afghanistan. And the Afghanistan is going to consolidate, and the people that do like the Taliban like them because of that history of the Taliban breaking up the Mujahideen control and bringing in goods and food and dropping costs and stuff like that. And of course, the Taliban's had a hard time doing that for the last 20 years because they've been fighting with us. And why were they fighting with us? Because we were in Afghanistan. The Taliban didn't attack us. They didn't fly planes into our buildings. That was AlQaeda. That was Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen originally was an enemy with the Taliban. So really, this is a picking your sides thing. And the United States is leaving on our terms. We didn't get pushed out of Afghanistan. We're leaving because Biden said we're leaving. So we're leaving on our terms. We're leaving because we want to, not because we have to. We could stay. We could carpet bomb the entire country into oblivion if we wanted to. So this isn't a strategic loss. It's not a military loss. It might be a diplomatic failure. I could definitely agree with that, but not yet, because it depends. We could be friends with the Taliban because Trump signed multiple agreements with the Taliban. And say what you will about that. The Democrats hated it, but now the Democrats are, interestingly, everybody seems to be mad at Biden right now. But the Democrats aren't mad because he's kind of working with the Taliban. That's the Republicans. The Democrats are mad because people are falling off of planes and stuff. I don't know. It's getting really complicated over here. Just imagine how bad it is in Afghanistan. But again, strong central power. Taliban's going to have what it takes. And they already have a bit of the hearts and minds thing. And now they also have the military credibility because the media keeps saying that America's retreating. So everybody calls it America's retreating, the greatest power on earth. And if America is retreating, quote unquote, from the Taliban, then that gives the Taliban credibility, which is the same thing that happened with China during the American-Korean War. Which is fine. It's whatever. Let them have their credibility. I think the Taliban being in control of Afghanistan is going to be a good thing. We're going to have an Islamic State. It's going to have Islamic rule. There's going to be Sharia law, most likely. But there's even... Hang on. So, a Taliban spokesperson by the name of Suhail Shaheen is saying that there's not going to be any retribution on Afghan people. Of course, we've seen some retribution on Afghan special operators and people who are directly fighting the Taliban. And maybe that's not what the central authorities of the Taliban want. Maybe it's just Taliban splinter groups. Maybe it's just bad actors, bad apples. But at the end of the day, the Taliban is setting up checkpoints and letting people through into the Kabul airport. So they're showing some good faith at the same time as all this other stuff is going on. Say what you will, you can even bash me all you want, but I think ultimately the Taliban is going to be a force for good in Afghanistan and take care of the Afghan people. That being said, I've been your host. Don't forget to dislike, unsubscribe, and leave a hateful comment. Thanks for watching.